during the Trump rallies, Trump used to brag about that one of his tenants was the Bank of China, the biggest Bank of China that was one of his tenants, and rented out space, I believe, in his Trump Tower building. He, in 2016 rallies, he used to say, I have the biggest Bank of China as one of my tenants in my building. And so when Congress revealed and made public Trump's tax records, it showed that Trump had bank accounts in China and he had shell companies in China. So is it a conflict of interest that Trump was imposing tariff wars on China? In other words, what would that bank do in order to have more fluidity and liquidity in their investments as the biggest bank of China? Would they be incentivized to launder money into Trump's bank account, Chinese bank account, and into Trump's shell companies that he had registered in China? It's a conflict of interest that the IRS should look into when it comes to auditing Trump's financial records. Because if Trump is imposing steep tariff wars while he was in office for 4 years on China, and the biggest bank of China was renting space in Trump Tower, then what would that bank do in order to free up liquidity in their investments as the biggest bank of China? Would they be incentivized to launder money into Trump's bank account, the Chinese bank account that he had, or into his shell companies that Trump had in China? You gotta understand, if you're the biggest bank of a country that's being imposed with tariff wars, what would you do to escape those detrimental debt tariff traps that Trump was imposing on China? So as the biggest bank of China, if they were to launder money into Trump's bank account just for Trump to avoid imposing tariffs in one of their economical sectors of investments of derivatives as the biggest bank of China, you can understand that that leaves a detrimental for extortion by Trump imposing tariff on the government of China. He can pick whatever sectors he wants to extort by imposing unfair tariff on that particular sector, business sector of China. In other words, would that bank be desperate enough to escape tariffing by America on their sectors? If they're the biggest bank of China, then what would they do to escape imposed tariffs on their economical sectors of portfolio investments in the Chinese government? In other words, why the IRS didn't audit Trump while he was in office for 4 years, while Trump was basically bragging about, hey, I have the biggest bank of China renting, and they're one of my biggest tenants. They rent space in my Trump Tower building. He kept on bragging about that he had the biggest bank of China as being one of his tenants, renting a space in their building with their bank branch located in his building. So what would that bank do to free up liquidity investments in portfolio hedge funds to avoid tariff importations of Chinese goods coming into America? What would they do? You gotta ask yourself why Trump had a Chinese bank account and why Trump had Chinese shell companies. And how desperate was that bank to escape from unfair importation tariffs that might have imposed on their investments of importing Chinese goods into America? That's something that the IRS should look into. And the fact that the IRS didn't audit Trump for 4 years while Trump was in office was mind-boggling. Remember when Trump said, I have no deals with Russia, while he crossed his fingers behind his back and was planning to do a Moscow tower and planning to give Putin a penthouse suite as a gift if Putin would have allowed and streamlined his Moscow tower. And he was planning to do this around 2015 while he was in his rally saying that he had no deals with Russia. In reality, behind the scenes, he was plotting to do a Moscow tower. So for the IRS not to audit, that it has been a tradition for them to audit presidents for several administrations, and for them not to audit Trump because Trump basically vetted out the IRS the same way he vetted out the Justice Department, the same way he vetted out the CIA, the same way he vetted out the FBI. So I'm not surprised why the IRS didn't audit Trump while he was in office for 4 years. But you gotta ask yourself, as the Chinese biggest bank, and they're one of his tenants, renting a branch rental commercial space in Trump Tower, what would they do as being one of China's biggest banks? What would they do to ingratiate themselves with Trump? In other words, when those bank portfolio investment hedge funds are trying to derive market investments of Chinese companies importing goods into America, what would they do to escape from tariffs being imposed on their Chinese imports as China's biggest bank? Would they be willing to launder money to Trump's Chinese bank account or through Trump's Chinese shell companies? It's like a mobster, an extortion of a mobster in those days when they used to break storefront windows and say it'd be a shame if somebody was to toss a rock and break your windows. That's why you should pay us. You know how a mobster used to have extortion protection brackets with merchants? That's how Trump was doing with this Bank of China, inflicting for 4 years steep tariffs. He was obsessed with imposing tariffs on China and all the sectors of the Chinese economies. What would that bank, being the Chinese biggest bank, how desperate would they be to escape the pressure of tariff wars between Trump and China? How desperate would they be to avoid in their sectors of portfolio investments a Trump imposed, self-imposed tariff in their particular investment sectors as the Chinese biggest bank? So for the IRS not to investigate Trump for 4 years while he was in office, knowing that Trump, he was bragging about, hey, I have China's biggest bank as one of my tenants, tower. They have a branch rented out in my building. And for 4 years for Trump to impose tariff wars on China, how desperate would that bank be to free up liquidity in their portfolio investments of commerce, Chinese commerce, to avoid any tariff imposing tariffs by American imposing tariff sanctions on imports into America? It's like Trump is an extortionist saying it'd be a shame for a rock to fly into your window. That's why you should pay us to protect you. It's basically that bank is being extorted in a way. If you got £1 billion of tariffs imposing profiteering and impeding your country from deriving wealth, how desperate would that Chinese bank be to pay off Trump in order to evade tariffs in their sectors of commerce? If you're the Chinese biggest bank and for 4 years Trump is extorting China with tariffs, how desperate would that bank be to avoid American tariffs? Ask yourself that, IRS. For 4 years, Trump had and to this day, he has a Chinese account. And he has Chinese shell companies. Not to mention, Trump, hey, I have no deals in Russia, crossing his fingers behind his back while he was trying to develop his Trump Tower Moscow deal and promising Putin a free penthouse on top of his Moscow tower. This is why he's standing at rallies and lying to Americans, saying that he had no Russian pending business deals in 2015. Trump is a swindler. He laid down with Abdul for the love of Turkmenistan pipeline, because ExxonMobil wanted to control the pipeline for running Arctic Russian energy into Turkmenistan pipeline that ran eventually. That pipeline runs into India and into China. So that's the reason why Trump negotiated with Abdul and the Taliban to give the Taliban rule of the Afghan government. The purest desecration to 9/11 was Trump laying down for the love of profiteering as a con artist, snakes oil drifter, of a swindler, just to sell profiteering oils for ExxonMobil to profiteer flooding India and China with Russian Arctic energy. He desecrated the legacy of 9/11 by giving his friend Abdul rule and clemency with his prison reform for 5,000 Afghan Taliban prisoners. He freed them all from prison and gave over Afghanistan on a silver platter just for them to promise not to terrorize that pipeline that transmitted Arctic joint venture Exxon Energy with Gazprom and Rosneft to flood energy into India and into China. Trump is a swindler, a shyster. He says, I know the good negotiators. I know the ones that are overrated. I know the ones that you never heard about. You ever heard about Carl Icahn? He's one of the best negotiators. He was saying that at 2015 rallies, while Carl Icahn was making a pay-for-play scheme with the Taj Mahal to get Trump out of debt obligations, bankruptcy, by buying out the Taj Mahal and alleviating Trump's debt obligations to that bank-shuttered casino. And in turn, Trump made him his White House economical strategic advisor, and he made Carl Icahn a fortune in American gas refinery businesses. These people enrich themselves and ingratiate themselves into racketeering in the White House and making the White House into a Ponzi scheme while they enrich their private industries. And they extort the White House like a business racketeering criminal organization. I'm not surprised that the tax returns revealed that Trump had a Chinese bank account, and that he has Chinese shell companies. At the same time, he's bragging about how he's the landlord of China's biggest bank at the Trump Tower. I understood that was something odd for him to be bragging about that. He has the biggest bank of China as tenants, commercial tenants in his Trump Tower, and then at the same time imposing obsession of imposing all his tariff wars. His tariff wars with France, his tariff war with Germany, his tariff war with Canada, his tariff war with Mexico, his tariff war with Japan, and his tariff wars with China. Out of all those tariff wars, he obsessed heavily over China. And I said to myself, hold on, doesn't he has renting space to one of the biggest bank of China in his Trump Tower? Is that not a conflict of interest? That as the president, he's imposing tariffs? Won't that bank be desperate to make profits and escape bankruptcy with their portfolio investments? Would they be desperate enough to launder money into Trump's Chinese bank accounts or to Trump's shell companies and launder money into his Chinese bank accounts? What would you do if you're the biggest bank of China and an American president? You're a tenant in his commercial building, but he's imposing tariffs on your country, and he has the power to bankrupt your bank as the biggest bank of China. Would you be desperate to launder money into his bank accounts just for him to avoid imposing tariffs in your sectors of commerce as your investment portfolios are concerned? As the biggest bank of China, won't you be desperate to not be bankrupt by tariff wars? It's like Trump is like a mobster saying it would be a shame if somebody tosses and breaks that storefront window. You should pay us for protection. It's kind of like an extortion. Trump was in a position of extorting the biggest bank of China. And that's something that the IRS should consider when they didn't audit Trump for 4 years while Trump had his bragging about how he was the landlord of the biggest bank of China, renting commercial space to the biggest bank of China at his Trump Towers. At the same time, imposing for 4 years tariff wars on China that most likely the Chinese biggest bank would have been desperate to escape underneath the tonnage of pressure of tariff wars imposed in their sectors of Chinese investments as far as the bank liquidity is concerned. Would it not be odd for them to be desperate to launder money into Trump's Chinese shell companies and then park money into Trump's Chinese bank accounts? I'm just saying, he should have been audited while he was in office. While he was crossing his fingers behind his back and saying, hey, I have no deals in Russia. I have no deals. I had never no deals pending in Russia. But behind his back, he's crossing his fingers and saying, hey, I want to build a Moscow tower, a Trump Moscow tower, and tell Putin I'll give him a penthouse for free if he streamlines the development deal of this Trump Moscow tower. But at the same time, he's lying through his teeth, telling his supporters, in 2015, I have no deals in Russia. I have no pending deals. I never had no pending deals in Russia. While he's lying through his teeth, and behind the scenes, he was trying to build his Moscow tower. Not to mention when he laid down with Abdul for the love of oil, as a snake oil con artist that he is.